In the winter of 1477, the fields outside Nancy were silent beneath snow. What would unfold there was not a clash of equals, nor a duel between rising powers. It was a violent end of a dream, the collapse of a political vision that had nearly reshaped Western Europe. At its center stood Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, ambitious, relentless, and increasingly isolated. For years, Charles had pursued a single objective: to carve out a continuous Burgundian kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. Burgundy was already wealthy, perhaps the richest polity in Europe. Its cities thrived on cloth and trade. Its court glittered with ceremony and culture. But wealth was not enough. Charles wanted sovereignty. He wanted a crown, and that ambition required expansion. To the east lay Lorraine, a narrow but critical corridor between Burgundy's northern and southern possessions. Without it, Charles's lands remained divided. With it, his kingdom would be whole. In 1475, he seized Nancy, capital of the Duchy of Lorraine, driving out its young ruler, René II of Lorraine. To Charles, it seemed another decisive step forward. Lorraine would be absorbed. The corridor would close. But conquest on parchment was not the same as control in winter. René fled, but he did not submit. He moved quickly through Europe's diplomatic web, seeking allies among those who already feared Burgundian power. Chief among them were the Swiss Confederates, a loose alliance of cantons whose infantry had already proven capable of shattering knightly armies. Charles underestimated them. He had seen Swiss troops before, stubborn, disciplined, heavily armed with pikes. But to him, they were provincial infantry, useful perhaps, but not decisive against professional Burgundian hosts equipped with artillery, cavalry, and experienced mercenaries. He believed his army represented the future of warfare: gunpowder, heavy cavalry, centralized command. He believed the Swiss represented the past. He would learn otherwise. The strategic trap by late 1476. Charles's position had grown precarious. His earlier campaigns had gone poorly. At Grandson and Merton, Swiss forces had humiliated Burgundian armies. Supplies had been lost. Prestige had cracked. Yet Charles refused retreat. To withdraw now would signal weakness to rivals, especially Louis XI of France, who quietly funded opposition to Burgundy and waited patiently for overreach. Nancy became more than a city. It became a statement. In October 1476, René returned with a coalition army and laid siege to Nancy. The city, garrisoned by Burgundians, endured months of cold and starvation. By December, the situation inside was desperate. Horses were slaughtered. Civilians rationed scraps. Disease crept through frozen streets. Charles could not allow Nancy to fall. In early January 1477, he marched south through snow and wind to relieve the city. His force was smaller than in previous campaigns, perhaps 12,000, 15,000 men, composed of Burgundian nobles, Italian condottieri, English archers, German handgunners, and remnants of earlier defeats. It was not the grand host he once commanded, but it was still formidable. Winter punished them as they advanced. Armor froze. Gunpowder had to be kept dry beneath cloaks. Supply lines stretched thin across hostile terrain. Foraging became difficult under snow cover. Morale was uneven, not broken, but strained. Many in the ranks had survived earlier disasters. They had seen Swiss columns descend without hesitation, pikes bristling like moving walls. They knew this enemy would not negotiate. Charles established camp near Nancy, positioning his army on elevated ground to block René's approach. He intended to hold defensively, using terrain to neutralize Swiss aggression. He still believed in structure, in artillery placement, in fixed lines. But weather does not respect structure. A heavy snowfall blanketed the landscape in the days before battle. Fields disappeared beneath white drifts. Roads blurred. Visibility shortened. What had been carefully scouted terrain became an indistinct expanse of frozen hills and woods. For the Swiss, accustomed to alpine winters, this was not a deterrent. It was concealment. A duke under pressure, Charles faced a narrowing set of choices. Retreat would abandon Nancy and confirm weakness. Delay would allow the besiegers to strengthen their position. Attack risked another Swiss confrontation, something his army could ill afford. He chose engagement. His plan was straightforward: anchor his right flank on woodland, fortify his front with artillery and field works, and force the Swiss to attack uphill through snow. Burgundian cannons would disrupt formations. Cavalry would exploit disorder. On paper, it was sound. But war on paper does not account for fatigue, frostbite, and memory. Among Burgundian veterans, there lingered a psychological scar from Merton, where Swiss columns had advanced despite artillery and broken them through sheer momentum. Fear was not openly spoken, but it moved quietly through the camp. Charles sensed this. His leadership style had grown increasingly rigid after past defeats. He punished dissent. He demanded discipline. To him, morale was maintained through authority. Yet authority does not warm freezing hands. On the opposing side, René's coalition gathered strength. The Swiss contingent, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 pikemen supported by halberdiers and handgunners, marched with characteristic cohesion. They moved in dense columns, each camp maintaining its own banners, but operating in coordinated formations. Swiss warfare relied on speed, shock, and relentless forward pressure. Their pike squares functioned as offensive weapons, mobile fortresses designed to punch through enemy lines before artillery could disorganize them. They understood one essential truth: momentum creates fear, and fear spreads faster in winter. The eve of decision, by January 4th, 1477, both armies faced each other across a frozen landscape west of Nancy. Snow continued to fall. Visibility narrowed further. Charles deployed his men carefully. Artillery pieces were placed to command open ground. Infantry formed behind earthworks hastily prepared in frozen soil. Cavalry waited on the flanks, though maneuverability in deep snow would be limited. He expected a frontal assault. He did not expect the Swiss to maneuver through woodland. In the Swiss camp, commanders assessed terrain differently. Rather than attack directly into prepared guns, they resolved to advance through the snow-covered forest on Burgundian left, turning the flank. It was a dangerous move. Forest movement in winter risked confusion. Units could lose alignment. Drums and horns might not carry clearly. Coordination could falter. But Swiss discipline was built on close physical proximity. Their columns marched shoulder to shoulder. Pikes angled upward like frozen spears against the sky. They trusted proximity over visibility. As dawn approached on January 5th, silence hung heavy across the hills. Snow absorbed sound. The world felt smaller, contained within a white horizon. Charles stood at the center of his line, armored, resolute. He had staked his dynasty on this field. He could not yet see the Swiss columns moving through trees beyond his left, but they were already advancing, slowly, deliberately, through snow that concealed both distance and intention. And when they emerged, it would not be where Burgundy expected. Morning on January 5th, 1477 broke, without color. The sky over Lorraine was a flat winter gray, heavy with drifting snow that softened the ridgelines and blurred the edges of forest and field. Beneath that sky, Charles the Bold arranged what remained of his power into a defensive crescent west of Nancy. He selected a position slightly elevated above the surrounding plain, its right flank secured against a wooded slope, and its front protected by shallow entrenchments dug into frozen earth. His artillery, though fewer than in earlier campaigns, was placed to command the most direct avenue of approach. Behind the guns stood ranks of infantry, Burgundian men-at-arms, English archers hardened by continental service, German handgunners, and Italian mercenaries whose contracts tied them to a cause that was no longer clearly ascendant. Cavalry formed in reserve, armored nobles mounted on war horses that pawed uneasily at snow-packed ground, their breath steaming in the cold. Charles expected an advance across open terrain. His previous encounters with Swiss forces had taught him their preference for concentrated frontal assaults, massed columns that struck like battering rams. He believed that if forced to climb a snowy incline into prepared artillery, the Swiss would finally break against discipline and firepower. His thinking was not irrational. Burgundian armies represented one of the most modern military systems in Europe, organized, paid, supported by logistics and gunpowder. Yet winter distorted calculation. Snow muffled artillery reports, obscured distances, and concealed movement. More dangerously, it narrowed perception. Scouts could see less. Commanders could judge less. Even sound traveled unpredictably through trees. Opposite him, The coalition army under René II of Lorraine formed beyond immediate sight. René's force combined Lorrainers, Alsatian contingents, and above all the Swiss Confederates. Perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 disciplined infantry whose reputation had already scarred Burgundian memory at Grandson and Merton. Swiss warfare did not depend on elaborate siege trains or complex cavalry maneuvers. It relied on cohesion and aggression. The core of their strength lay in dense pike formations, blocks of men advancing shoulder to shoulder with 18-foot ash shafts angled forward. Interspersed among them were halberdiers trained to exploit breaches, and handgunners tasked with skirmishing and disruption. The formation moved as a single organism, guided by drums and banners rather than by intricate command hierarchies. The Swiss commanders studied Charles's deployment and saw the guns positioned to devastate a frontal charge. They chose instead a maneuver that required confidence bordering on audacity, a wide flanking march through snow-covered woodland to strike the Burgundian left. It was a calculated risk. Moving thousands of men through forests in winter could fragment columns and delay coordination. But Swiss training emphasized proximity. Each soldier remained within arm's reach of his comrades, minimizing the chance of dissolution. The snow that limited Burgundian vision would also shield Swiss approach. As the morning advanced, Burgundian artillery fired intermittently into the open plain, probing for movement. The reports echoed dully across the frozen landscape, smoke hanging low and slow in the cold air. Yet no masked enemy appeared where expected. Charles waited. Time passed in uneasy stillness. Men shifted weight from numb feet to ease the ache of frostbite. Horses stamped and tossed their heads. Officers strained to read the white horizon for signs of assault. Then, to the Burgundian left, faint shapes emerged between tree trunks, dark vertical lines moving with unnatural regularity. At first they seemed distant shadows. Within minutes they resolved into the bristling forest of pikes. The Swiss columns had completed their march and were now descending toward the exposed flank. Charles reacted quickly, ordering reserves to pivot and artillery to adjust orientation. But repositioning heavy guns in snow proved slow and imprecise. Wheels bogged down. Teams struggled for traction. Fields of fire narrowed by woodland limited the effective sweep of cannon. What had been carefully aligned for a frontal defense was ill-suited to sudden lateral threat. The Swiss advance accelerated once clear of the trees. Drums beat a steady cadence, not rapid but relentless, designed to synchronize movement rather than inflame emotion. Their formation maintained depth, multiple ranks pressing forward so that no individual could hesitate without feeling the weight of comrades behind him. Snow reached the shins in places, but momentum carried them downhill with gathering force. Burgundian handgunners and archers loose volleys. Some Swiss fell, pikes dropping from numbed hands, but the formation absorbed casualties without visible disruption. The density of the column ensured that gaps were filled instantly. Artillery finally fired grapeshot at close range, tearing bloody channels to the front ranks. Yet even this did not halt advance. Survivors stepped over bodies, maintaining forward pressure. Psychology shifted in those moments. Burgundian soldiers, many veterans of earlier defeats, recognized the pattern. They had seen this advance before. The refusal to recoil under fire, the steady narrowing of distance. Memory magnified fear. Discipline wavered the edges first. Individuals stepping back, officers shouting to hold alignment. Cavalry attempt to countercharge were constrained by terrain. Snow reduced speed, and wooded ground broke formation before impact could be decisive. Where mounted men did reach Swiss flanks, pike hedges met them with lethal geometry. Horses balked to the wall of spear points, some impaling themselves in panic. Charles rode among his troops, urging steadiness, attempting to coordinate countermeasures. He remained conspicuous, armored and visible, a figure of authority amid chaos. Yet the battle no longer unfolded according to his plan. What he faced was not merely an enemy formation, but a cumulative collapse of expectation. His line, bent from its original orientation, now fought at angles, units partially isolated from one another. Communication degraded. Snow and smoke thickened together, obscuring signals. The Swiss struck the Burgundian, left with concentrated mass. Pikes met pikes, halberds hacked at armor joints, and hand-to-hand combat erupted in compressed spaces where movement was limited by drifts and bodies alike. The pressure was physical and psychological. Each Burgundian soldier felt not only the force of the opponent before him, but the sensation of being outnumbered locally as Swiss depth reinforced the point of contact. Gradually, the Burgundian flank began to fold, not in sudden rout, but in incremental retreat, steps backward that widened into gaps. Once those openings formed, Swiss halberdiers exploited them ruthlessly, cutting into the interior of the line. Units lost cohesion. Some attempted to realign toward the center, inadvertently exposing additional weaknesses. Charles committed reserves in a final effort to stabilize the field. Italian mercenaries advanced to plug breaches, fighting with professional determination. For a time, resistance stiffened, yet the Swiss columns had not committed all their strength at once. Secondary formations now pressed forward, widening the assault front and preventing any single Burgundian counterstroke from restoring balance. What unfolded was not dramatic chaos, but grinding attrition. Snow, churned to slush and stained dark, reduced footing. Men slipped as they struck. Wounded soldiers disappeared beneath advancing ranks. The noise remained strangely muted by weather, shouts and steel absorbed into the heavy air. By midday, Burgundian structure had deteriorated beyond repair. Segments of the army fought isolated battles with no clear sense of overall position. The right flank, initially secure, found itself indirectly threatened as the left collapsed inward. Artillery crews abandoned pieces that could no longer be protected. Cavalry withdrew in fragments, some attempting escape routes already compromised by Swiss movement. Charles remained on the field, attempting to rally what forces he could. Yet the psychological center of his army had shifted. Confidence, once anchored in his authority and in technological advantage, had dissolved under sustained pressure. The Swiss had not relied on surprise alone. They had combined maneuver with relentless forward drive, forcing Burgundy to react rather than dictate. As Burgundian resistance thinned, Swiss columns pushed through toward the rear, severing lines of retreat. What had begun as a defensive posture on elevated ground now became a trap. Snow that concealed approach now hindered escape. Men fled into woodland only to encounter advancing enemy units or lose direction entirely. The battle was not yet fully decided, but its trajectory had become unmistakable. Burgundy's elite force, professional, diverse, modern, was being dismantled by cohesion and calculated aggression. The winter field outside Nancy, once chosen for its defensive promise, was transforming into a landscape of disintegration. And somewhere within that tightening circle of pressure, the Duke still fought, unwilling to concede that the structure he had built over years of ambition was dissolving in a single frozen morning. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield had been transformed from a structured deployment into a chaotic expanse of snow-stained red and broken armor. The Burgundian army, once a cohesive instrument of state power, had been ground down by a combination of tactical ingenuity, relentless pressure, and the unforgiving winter terrain. The Swiss pike squares pressed relentlessly, their momentum now unimpeded as gaps in Burgundian line widened into corridors of collapse. The heavy cavalry, previously a decisive arm in Burgundian campaigns, had been neutralized by poor footing, constrained movement, and the pike formations that refused to yield. Horses stumbled, panicked, or fell, leaving mounted knights stranded among dense infantry or snow drifts. Infantry units, initially well-armed and disciplined, found themselves isolated, their orders impossible to communicate across a battlefield that had become both physically and psychologically disorienting. Command cohesion, which had been Charles the Bold's greatest asset, disintegrated as subordinate leaders struggled to maintain alignment under constant pressure and ever-shifting lines of engagement. Charles himself remained on horseback near the center of the field, striving to impose order where none could survive. His eyes, armored yet unblinking, scanned the advancing Swiss as though she could restore the strategic balance. Around him, banners toppled. Standards were cut down and pockets of men attempted desperate counterattacks, only to be enveloped by the relentless Swiss advance. The Duke's personal retinue, the core of his martial identity, was being systematically eliminated or forced to retreat. Knights fell one by one, their armor useless against the concentrated pike thrusts and coordinated halberd strikes. Swiss columns moved with terrifying synchronicity. Individual casualties were quickly replaced by men pressing forward from the ranks behind, maintaining the integrity of the formation. For Burgundian soldiers, Every attempt to hold a line or mount a counterattack carried the weight of futility. Fatigue, cold, and fear combined to create a sense of inevitability, a creeping certainty that resistance could not succeed. The psychological impact of seeing comrades fall and lines collapse without recourse weighed as heavily as the physical danger of the pikes themselves. By early afternoon, the collapse of the Burgundian left and center had accelerated into a broader disintegration. Swiss halberdiers and pikemen exploited every breach with mechanical precision, pushing through into artillery positions and cutting down gunners before they could reload. Cannons were abandoned, dragged off by retreating teams, or destroyed to prevent capture, and the defensive works Charles had relied upon were rendered ineffective by the Swiss ability to outmaneuver and overwhelm localized positions. The snow, which had initially been thought to favor defenders, now acted as a medium concealment for Swiss flanking maneuvers and as an impediment for Burgundian mobility, trapping men in areas from which escape was impossible. Every moment that passed without successful counteraction amplified the sense of collapse. Commanders shouted orders that never reached their intended units. Messengers were intercepted or lost in the drift, and the cohesion of the army, already strained from months of attrition, eroded almost entirely. Amid this, Charles attempted to coordinate a central rally, a final effort to stabilize the corps forces. He ordered reserves forward, men who had been held back for precisely such a moment, hoping that a concentrated thrust might blunt the Swiss momentum. For a brief instant, a small section of the line stiffened, and Burgundian knights engaged Swiss halberdiers in brutal melee. The clash of steel rang sharply against the muted soundscape of winter, but the effect was temporary. Swiss discipline and density absorbed the shock, countered with methodical force, and pushed the defenders back. Each successive counterattack consumed more of Charles's remaining strength, yet yielded diminishing returns. Exhaustion in the cold of winter made armor heavier, pikes harder to wield, and morale increasingly fragile. The attempt to stabilize the line ultimately failed, leaving the Duke's army fragmented and disorganized. By late afternoon, the situation had become irretrievable. The Burgundian army, once a symbol of wealth, power, and ambition, was now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance attempting to avoid total annihilation. Retreat was difficult if not impossible. Terrain, snow, and advancing enemy units limited escape routes. Some soldiers attempted to flee toward Nancy, hoping the city could provide a temporary refuge, only to find paths blocked or patrols of Swiss cavalry intercepting and cutting them down. Others attempted to regroup in wooded areas, only to become isolated and overwhelmed individually. The Swiss, maintaining tight formations and relentless pressure, converted every weakness into advantage. The psychological impact of seeing entire units collapse while pike points advanced without hesitation created panic. Once determined soldiers now acted on instinct rather than orders, fleeing when resistance might still have been possible in a more coherent structure. It was in this maelstrom that Charles the Bold met his end. Reports indicate that he attempted to rally a final force near the center of his remaining troops, urging men to stand and strike. He was seen actively engaging in combat, attempting to organize a counterattack even as the surroundings dissolved into chaos. His armor, previously a symbol of invincibility, became both shield and trap, heavy, restrictive, and difficult to move in snow-laden terrain. In the confusion, he was separated from any coherent bodyguard, attacked by Swiss pikemen and killed. His death, sudden and violent, removed the final psychological anchor of Burgundian army. Without the Duke, remaining leaders could not maintain coordination, and organized resistance collapsed entirely. Soldiers fled or surrendered in whatever fragmented groups could form, leaving the battlefield effectively under Swiss control. The aftermath of the engagement was as decisive as it was tragic. Burgundian casualties were catastrophic, not only in numbers but in the qualitative loss of experienced soldiers, professional knights, and officers. Entire families of the Burgundian nobility were extinguished or scattered, leaving a political vacuum in a state that had been built around the Duke's ambition and vision. For the Swiss and their allies, the victory confirmed both the effectiveness of disciplined pike warfare and the strategic advantage of maneuver, morale, and cohesion over purely technological or hierarchical superiority. The psychological impact of the battle resonated across Europe. News of the Duke's death and destruction of his army reached courts in France, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond, influencing diplomacy and realigning regional power dynamics. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the Battle of Nancy marked a broader historical turning point. Burgundy, once poised to become a kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, fractured after Charles's death. Territories reverted to France, the Holy Roman Empire, or local dynasties, reshaping the map of Western Europe. Swiss soldiers, their reputation cemented by their disciplined success against a technologically sophisticated opponent, became highly sought-after mercenaries throughout the continent, their methods studied and emulated. The collapse also demonstrated the limits of armored nobility and centralized armies in the face of disciplined, cohesive infantry employing combined arms tactics, particularly in adverse terrain and weather. Military thinking in Europe began to adjust. Cavalry charges were no longer assumed decisive. Artillery required coordinated protection, and the psychological dimensions of command and morale became increasingly recognized as determinants of battlefield outcomes.